Don't you dare come for Christmas. We don't want to see you. That was the message my daughter sent me on Christmas Eve at 4:17 in the afternoon. I read it 3 times before I finally set my phone down on the kitchen counter. For a moment, the only sound in the house was the ticking of the old wall clock Robert had bought at an antique shop nearly 30 years ago. The smell of cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen. A pot of homemade soup simmered gently on the stove. Under the Christmas tree in my living room sat 6 wrapped presents, each one labeled with the name of a child or grandchild I loved more than anything. I stood there staring at them, wondering how a family could go from sharing Sunday dinners and holiday traditions to sending a message like that. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 72 years old, a widow, and until that afternoon, I still believed Christmas could heal almost anything. My husband Robert had been gone for 3 years. Some mornings I still expected to hear his footsteps in the hallway or his voice asking if I wanted another cup of coffee. Grief changes shape over time. It becomes quieter, less sharp, but it never truly leaves. After Robert passed away, I tried my best to keep the family together. I hosted dinners. I remembered birthdays. I mailed cards. I baked cookies for school events and attended every recital I was invited to, at least every recital I knew about. Looking back, I should have noticed the distance growing long before that message arrived. The invitations became less frequent. Phone calls grew shorter. Family plans often seemed to happen without me. Whenever I asked about it, there was always a reasonable explanation. Everyone was busy. The kids had activities. Work schedules were complicated. Life happened. That was what I told myself. Then my phone vibrated again. Another message appeared. This one was from my son Daniel. My heart lifted for a second. Daniel had always been the peacemaker in the family. As children, if Claire and I argued, he would find a way to make us laugh. Even after he married Evelyn, I liked to believe that part of him was still there. His message was only 5 words long. Maybe. It's better this way. I stared at the screen until the words blurred together. No explanation. No apology. No invitation. Just 5 words. Somehow they hurt more than Claire's message. Claire's anger felt obvious. Daniel's agreement felt final. I walked slowly into the living room and sat in Robert's old armchair. The Christmas lights reflected softly against the window. Outside, snow drifted across the front yard, covering everything in a blanket of white. It should have looked peaceful. Instead, it felt lonely. I looked toward the tree. Claire's present was a handmade photo album filled with family pictures. Daniel's was a vintage pocket watch I had spent months searching for, because it reminded me of one Robert used to carry. The grandchildren each had books, games, and small keepsakes I thought they would love. I had wrapped every gift carefully. I had imagined their smiles. I had imagined hearing laughter in this house again. Instead, I was sitting alone with a phone full of silence. Then I remembered something Robert once told me. When people show you who they are, Maggie, believe them. But before you make any decision, make sure you know the whole story. Those words stayed with me as I stood and crossed the room toward the hallway. At the end of it was Robert's old office. Most people thought I never went in there anymore. The truth was, I visited it often. It still smelled faintly of cedar and old books. I opened the closet door, reached behind a row of storage boxes, and pulled out a small steel lockbox. As I placed it on the desk, I realized something important. The Christmas message had ended one chapter of my life. What I was about to find inside that box might begin another. I sat at Robert's desk and ran my fingers across the surface worn smooth by decades of use. The lockbox sat in front of me, quiet and ordinary, yet somehow heavier than it had ever felt before. Outside, the wind pushed lightly against the windows, and the Christmas lights from the front porch cast soft reflections across the room. For several minutes I simply stared at the box. I was not afraid of what I might find inside. I was afraid of what it might confirm. Robert had always been organized. Every document had a place. Every important decision was written down. During our 46 years of marriage, I used to tease him about it. He would smile and say that one day I would appreciate knowing exactly where everything was. That night I finally did. I entered the combination and lifted the lid. Inside were neatly arranged folders, a few sealed envelopes, and Robert's familiar handwriting on nearly every label. Property records, insurance policies, Family trust documents. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then I noticed a cream-colored envelope resting beneath the others. My name was written across the front in blue ink. Margaret. Only Margaret. No date. No explanation. My chest tightened as I carefully opened it. The letter inside was only 2 pages long. I recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. If you are reading this, Maggie, something has happened that made you doubt the people around you. I hope I am wrong. I hope this letter is never needed. But if it is, I want you to remember something. You are stronger than you think. I stopped reading for a moment. Tears filled my eyes, but they did not fall. Robert always seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear. I continued reading slowly. The letter spoke about family, about trust, and about the importance of protecting myself if circumstances ever changed. He reminded me that kindness was a virtue, but blind trust was not. Near the end, he mentioned several documents stored in the box and instructed me to review them carefully if I ever felt pressured regarding property, finances, or living arrangements. That sentence stayed with me. Pressured regarding property, finances, or living arrangements. Seemed oddly specific. I folded the letter and reached for the next folder. As I examined the paperwork, memories began returning. Small moments. Tiny incidents I had dismissed at the time. Last spring, Evelyn had casually asked whether maintaining my house was becoming difficult. During the summer, Daniel mentioned how expensive home repairs could be for someone living alone. A few months later, Claire suggested that retirement communities were becoming very popular and offered wonderful activities for seniors. None of those conversations had seemed alarming individually. Together, they formed a different picture. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. Over the past year, I had slowly become an observer in my own family. Family dinners happened without me. School events came and went before I heard about them. Holiday plans seemed finalized before anyone bothered to call. I had blamed busy schedules. I had blamed distance. I had blamed myself. Maybe I talked too much about Robert. Maybe I called too often. Maybe I expected too much. Sitting there in Robert's office, I realized something painful. The distance had not appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly for years. My phone buzzed on the desk. For a moment, I hoped it was Daniel. Perhaps he regretted what he had written. Perhaps he wanted to explain. Instead, the screen displayed a social media notification. Claire had posted new family photos. I hesitated before opening them. The first image showed Claire smiling beside a decorated Christmas tree. The second showed Daniel, Evelyn, and the grandchildren gathered around a table filled with food. The third showed everyone together beneath a banner that read Family Christmas Celebration. Everyone except me. The timestamp showed the photos had been taken earlier that afternoon. Before the message. Before the rejection. Before I even knew there was a gathering. I stared at the screen for a long time. The hurt settled into something colder, clearer, more honest. Then I looked back at Robert's letter lying open beside me. For the first time that evening, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt curiosity, because if my family had worked this hard to keep me away, there had to be a reason, and I intended to find out what it was. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For years, Christmas morning had been my favorite day of the year. Robert used to wake up early, make coffee, and sit beside the tree with the lights on before anyone else arrived. We always said the house felt most magical in those quiet moments. This year, the silence felt different. It was not peaceful. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. I carried my coffee into the kitchen and sat by the window. Snow covered the backyard in a smooth blanket of white. The bird feeder Robert built years ago was nearly hidden beneath it. I watched a pair of cardinals land on the fence and suddenly remembered something else. About 8 months earlier, I had invited the grandchildren over for a weekend baking tradition. We had done it every December since the oldest turned 5. A few days before they were supposed to arrive, Evelyn called. She said the children were busy and would not make it. I had accepted the explanation without question. 2 weeks later, I saw photographs online. The children had spent that exact weekend making cookies at Evelyn's sister's house. At the time, I convinced myself it was a misunderstanding. Now it looked different. After breakfast, I returned to Robert's office. I began reviewing every document inside the lockbox. Most were exactly what I expected. insurance records, property information, trust paperwork. Then I found a folder labeled Family Assets Review. The contents were organized with Robert's usual precision. Several pages detailed ownership structures for different properties, investment accounts, and long-term plans. What caught my attention was a note attached to the front. If circumstances change, consult Martin Reynolds before signing anything. Martin Reynolds had been Robert's attorney for more than 20 years. I had not spoken to him in almost a year. My fingers rested on the note for several seconds. Then I picked up the phone and called his office. To my surprise, he answered personally. "Margaret," he said warmly. "Merry Christmas. I was actually thinking about you recently." There was something in his tone that made me sit a little straighter. "Martin," I said carefully, "I have been reviewing some documents Robert left behind." A brief silence followed. "I wondered if that day might come," he replied. My heart skipped slightly. "What do you mean?" Another pause. "Margaret, there are conversations that Robert and I had before he passed away. Conversations he hoped would never become relevant. If you are calling today, I suspect something has happened." I glanced toward the family photographs hanging on the wall. Claire smiling at her college graduation. Daniel holding his first fishing trophy. Robert standing proudly behind all of us. "Yes," I said quietly. "Something has happened." Martin listened patiently as I explained the messages, the Christmas gathering, and the growing distance I had noticed over the past few years. When I finished, he remained silent for several moments. "I think we should meet after the holiday," he finally said. "There are a few things you should understand about your situation." My situation. The phrase lingered in my mind long after the call ended. By mid-afternoon, I decided to leave the house for a while. The rooms felt too full of memories and unanswered questions. I drove to a small cafe a few miles away that Robert and I used to visit. The owner, Helen Carter, greeted me the moment I walked in. Helen had been our neighbor for nearly 15 years before moving across town. She hugged me warmly and insisted I sit near the fireplace. For the first time all day, I felt genuinely welcome. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, holiday decorations, community events. Then Helen's expression changed. She stirred her tea slowly before looking at me. "Margaret," she said carefully, "there is something I have been debating whether to tell you." The seriousness in her voice immediately caught my attention. "What is it?" I asked. Helen glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned slightly closer. "A few weeks ago, I overheard a conversation involving Daniel and Evelyn." My stomach tightened. "What kind of conversation?" Helen hesitated. "The kind that made me uncomfortable. They were discussing your house. And they seemed very confident that you would not be living there much longer." For several seconds I could not speak. The warmth from the cafe fireplace suddenly felt distant. Helen watched me carefully, as if trying to decide how much more she should say. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and waited. "What exactly did you hear?" I finally asked. Helen exhaled slowly. "I was having lunch at the Lakeside Bistro about 3 weeks ago. Daniel and Evelyn were seated in a booth near mine. I do not think they noticed me. First I was not paying attention. Then I heard your name." My stomach tightened. Helen continued carefully. "They were discussing timelines. That was the word they used. Timelines. Evelyn said something about getting everything settled before summer." I felt a chill run through me despite the warmth of the room. "Everything settled?" I repeated. Helen nodded. Then Daniel mentioned the house. He said maintenance was becoming expensive, and that eventually it would make more sense for everyone if the property changed hands. I stared at the table between us. The grain of the wood suddenly seemed more interesting than meeting her eyes. Not because I doubted her, because I believed her. Deep down, I already knew these pieces fit together too well. The conversations, the distance, the Christmas exclusion, the questions about retirement communities, the comments about living alone. Helen reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Margaret, I almost called you that day, but I kept telling myself maybe I misunderstood." I managed a small smile. "You were trying to protect me." She nodded. "Yes." We sat quietly for a moment. Then another memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, Daniel had offered to help organize my financial paperwork. He claimed he wanted to make things easier for me. At the time I thought it was thoughtful. Now I remembered how disappointed Evelyn seemed when I politely declined. Another memory followed. Last Thanksgiving, Claire spent nearly 20 minutes talking about a beautiful assisted living community outside Columbus. She described the activities, the dining rooms, the walking paths. At the time I assumed she was making conversation. Now I wondered if she had been testing my reaction. The pieces kept falling into place. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, like snow collecting on a rooftop until you finally notice the weight. After leaving the cafe, I drove home as dusk settled across the neighborhood. Christmas lights glowed from nearly every house. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children ran through front yards wearing red scarves and winter boots. Looked like a holiday postcard. Yet I felt as though I were seeing everything through different eyes. When I arrived home, I parked in the driveway but did not immediately go inside. Instead, I sat behind the steering wheel and thought about Robert. During our marriage, he always noticed things before I did. He could walk into a room and sense tension immediately. He understood motives, intentions, patterns. I used to joke that he could solve mysteries without leaving his recliner. One evening years ago, after a difficult business dispute, he told me something I never forgot. Most people reveal their plans long before they act on them. The problem is that we rarely listen because we assume the best. At the time I admired his wisdom. Sitting alone in my car that Christmas evening, I finally understood it. I had spent years assuming the best. I had explained away every uncomfortable feeling, every slight, every exclusion, every excuse. Not because I was foolish, because they were my children, because mothers want to believe their children would never intentionally hurt them. Inside the house, the Christmas tree still glowed softly in the living room. The presents remained exactly where I had left them. I removed my coat and walked directly to Robert's office. The lockbox remained open on the desk. Beside it sat the documents Martin Reynolds had told me to review carefully. This time I opened every folder, every page, every note, and buried near the back of one file, I discovered something that made me stop reading altogether. A document dated just 4 months before Robert passed away. At the bottom was his signature, and next to it was a handwritten note addressed specifically to Martin. If Margaret ever faces pressure from family regarding property decisions, activate the secondary protection provisions immediately. I read the note 3 times before setting the paper back down on the desk. The room seemed unusually quiet. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder than normal. Secondary protection provisions. The phrase felt formal and distant, yet Robert had underlined it twice. He wanted me to notice it. He wanted me to remember it. Spent the next hour reviewing the surrounding documents, searching for an explanation. Eventually, I found it inside another sealed folder addressed jointly to Martin Reynolds and me. The language was legal, but the meaning became clear after a few careful readings. Robert had established safeguards designed to prevent any transfer, sale, or reassignment of major family assets without multiple independent reviews. More importantly, he had included specific protections if he believed I was being pressured, manipulated, or isolated by family members. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Robert had never been suspicious by nature. He was thoughtful, practical. The fact that he created those provisions meant he had seen something long before I did. My phone buzzed. For the first time in days, I saw Daniel's name on the screen. My pulse quickened slightly. The message was short. Hope you had a nice Christmas. That was all. No mention of the family gathering. No explanation. No apology. No acknowledgement of the message Claire had sent. Just a simple sentence that pretended everything was normal. I looked at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone face down on the desk. A year ago, I would have responded immediately. I would have reassured him. I would have protected his feelings. This time I did nothing. The following morning I called Martin again. He answered on the second ring. I was expecting your call, he said. I told him about the note and the documents I had discovered. He listened carefully before responding. Margaret, there are details I would rather discuss in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? Of course, I replied. After we ended the call, I spent the rest of the day organizing paperwork. For the first time in years, I wanted a complete picture of my finances and property records. The process revealed something surprising. I was far more involved in the family assets than I had realized. Robert had structured many things jointly. Several accounts required my approval. Multiple properties could not be sold without my direct authorization. The more I learned, the more I understood why Robert had been so careful. That afternoon, another unexpected call arrived. It was Claire. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. "Hello, Claire," I said calmly. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Forced cheerful. "I was just checking in." I waited. "How was Christmas?" she asked. The question hung between us. Not "how are you?" Not "I am sorry." Just "how was Christmas?" "Quiet," I answered. Another pause followed. Then she quickly changed the subject. "Daniel and Evelyn are thinking about some long-term plans for the family. We should probably all sit down together sometime." Long-term plans. The same phrase Helen had heard. The same type of language that appeared in those conversations months ago. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. "That sounds interesting," I replied. "Perhaps we should." Claire sounded relieved. She spoke for another minute before ending the call. As soon as the line disconnected, I opened my notebook and wrote down every word I could remember. Later that evening, I stood at the living room window watching fresh snow fall across the neighborhood. Families were taking down decorations. Holiday lights blinked softly against the winter sky. Somewhere along the way, my children had begun discussing plans for my future without including me. They believed they were several steps ahead. What they did not know was that Robert had anticipated this possibility years ago. And tomorrow, sitting in Martin Reynolds's office, I intended to learn exactly how far ahead he had planned. The next morning arrived gray and cold. A thin layer of fresh snow covered the sidewalks as I drove across town to Martin Reynolds's office. The building had not changed much over the years. The same brick exterior. The same brass directory in the lobby. The same receptionist who greeted me with a warm smile and offered coffee before leading me to the conference room. Martin was already waiting when I entered. Several folders were spread neatly across the table. He stood, shook my hand, and motioned for me to sit. His expression was kind but serious. "Margaret," he said, "before we discuss these documents, I need to ask you something. Have Daniel or Claire ever asked you to sign paperwork related to your property, finances, or future living arrangements?" I thought carefully. "Not directly," I answered, "but there have been conversations, suggestions, questions." Martin nodded as though he expected that answer. He opened one of the folders and slid a document toward me. Robert anticipated that possibility. I looked down at the page. It was part of the family trust agreement. Several sections were highlighted. Martin pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. "Your husband created what he called protective review provisions. They require additional legal oversight if anyone attempts to influence major decisions involving your assets." I read the paragraph twice. The language was complex, but the purpose was clear. Robert had built safeguards around nearly everything. Why would he do this? I asked quietly. Martin folded his hands. Because he noticed patterns. That answer lingered in the room. What kind of patterns? Martin hesitated before speaking. Toward the end of his life, Robert became concerned about how frequently certain family discussions revolved around property rather than relationships. He never accused anyone of wrongdoing, but he wanted to make sure you were protected. I looked out the conference room window. Cars moved through the snowy streets below. Life continued as normal outside while mine seemed to be rearranging itself piece by piece. Martin opened another folder. "There is something else you should know." He handed me a summary sheet listing major assets connected to the trust. As my eyes moved down the page, I felt genuine surprise. Several properties I assumed belonged entirely to the family trust required my direct approval for any future transaction. The vacation lake house. The rental property outside Columbus. Even certain investment accounts. Robert had quietly ensured that I remained central to every major decision. "Daniel knows this?" I asked. "Not completely," Martin replied. Most beneficiaries understand only the portions relevant to them. For the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. Not because of the money. Because Robert had not left me vulnerable. He had seen possibilities I never considered. After our meeting ended, Martin walked me to the elevator. Just before the doors closed, he said something that stayed with me all afternoon. "Margaret, do not make any sudden decisions. Listen carefully. Observe. People reveal far more when they believe they are already winning." On the drive home, I replayed those words repeatedly. That evening, another message arrived from Claire. This time she wanted to schedule a family meeting the following weekend. According to her, everyone wanted to discuss long-term plans and future responsibilities. The wording felt polished, practiced, almost rehearsed. A few minutes later, Daniel sent a separate message encouraging me to attend. Neither mentioned Christmas. Neither acknowledged the hurt. Neither asked how I was doing. I stared at the messages while sitting beside the living room window. The Christmas tree still glowed softly in the corner. Most people would have focused on what had been lost. Instead, I found myself focusing on something different. For the first time, I understood the board they were playing on. More importantly, they did not realize I could finally see it too. I picked up my notebook, wrote down the date and time of the upcoming meeting, then closed the cover. If they wanted a conversation about the future, I would be there. And for the first time in a very long while, I would arrive prepared. The week passed more quietly than I expected. No angry messages arrived. No dramatic confrontations occurred. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly normal. Yet beneath that calm, I could feel something building. The family meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Daniel's house. During those days leading up to it, I focused on observation rather than reaction. I reviewed documents. I organized notes. I reread Robert's letters. Most importantly, I stopped making excuses for other people's behavior. That simple change altered everything. When Saturday finally arrived, the sky was overcast and the roads were damp from a recent snowfall. I drove across town and pulled into Daniel's driveway exactly on time. Several vehicles were already parked outside. Through the front window, I could see movement in the living room. Laughter drifted faintly through the glass. For a brief moment, an old familiar sadness touched me. This gathering looked remarkably similar to dozens of family gatherings from years past. The difference was that now I understood I had not been invited to participate in many of them. I had been invited because they wanted something. Evelyn opened the door before I could knock. Her smile appeared warm, but it never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret, we are so glad you came," she said. The sentence sounded polished, as though she had practiced it beforehand. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied. Inside, Claire sat on the sofa scrolling through her phone. Daniel stood near the fireplace holding a cup of coffee. The grandchildren were upstairs, conveniently absent from whatever conversation was about to take place. Everyone greeted me politely. Too politely. The atmosphere felt strangely formal. After a few minutes of small talk, Daniel cleared his throat and suggested we move to the dining room table. The moment we sat down, I understood why. A folder rested beside his chair. Another sat in front of Evelyn. Claire had a notepad. This was not a family visit. This was a presentation. Daniel began speaking. His voice sounded careful and measured. He talked about planning ahead, about reducing stress, about making sure everyone understood future responsibilities. I listened without interruption. Then Evelyn took over. She spoke about housing costs, maintenance expenses, and the challenges faced by older adults living alone. Her tone remained pleasant throughout. If someone walked into the room midway through the conversation, they might have mistaken it for concern. But I noticed something important. Neither of them asked what I wanted. Neither asked how I felt. They discussed my future as though I were a project rather than a person. Claire joined in next. She described a retirement community located outside Columbus. Beautiful grounds, social activities, medical support, transportation services. The brochure she handed me featured smiling seniors walking beside a pond beneath bright summer skies. I glanced through it slowly, then I set it down. "You have clearly spent a great deal of time researching this," I said. The three of them exchanged quick looks. Tiny movements, barely noticeable, Yet they revealed more than words. Daniel leaned forward. "Mom, we just want what is best for you." There it was. The phrase everyone uses when they have already decided what is best for someone else. I nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate your concern." Relief flashed across Evelyn's face. She thought I was agreeing. She thought the conversation was moving exactly where she wanted it to go. Then Daniel opened the folder beside him. "There are also a few documents we thought you might review." My eyes dropped to the papers. At the top of the first page appeared several familiar words. Property review. Housing transition. Future planning authorization. I felt completely calm. In fact, calmer than I had felt in years. Because sitting there at that table, watching their confidence grow, I finally understood something Martin Reynolds had tried to teach me. People reveal the most when they believe resistance is gone. And judging by the expressions around that table, they believed they had already won. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Daniel slid the documents toward me with the quiet confidence of someone expecting a simple signature. Evelyn folded her hands neatly on the table. Claire watched my face carefully, searching for clues. I lowered my eyes to the first page and read every line. Housing transition authorization. Property management review. Financial coordination consent. The wording appeared harmless at first glance. Yet after my meetings with Martin, I understood exactly what I was looking at. These papers would not immediately transfer ownership of anything. They would simply open doors. Small doors at first, then larger ones later. Robert used to say that major changes rarely arrive all at once. They arrive disguised as reasonable requests. I turned another page, then another. Finally, I placed the stack neatly back on the table. "You have all put a great deal of effort into this," I said. Evelyn smiled. "We only want to make things easier for you." There it was again. Easier. Safer. Better. Different words. Same destination. Daniel nodded. "Nobody is asking you to decide today, Mom. We just thought it would be smart to start planning." I looked around the table. For a moment, I saw not the adults sitting before me but the children they used to be. Claire riding her bicycle for the first time. Daniel learning how to cast a fishing line beside Robert at the lake. Family vacations. School concerts. Birthday cakes. Memories filled with laughter. The contrast hurt more than I expected. Not because they wanted something. Because somewhere along the way they had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obstacle to a plan. I folded my hands calmly. "Actually," I said, "there are a few things I learned recently that make this conversation very interesting." The expressions around the table shifted almost immediately. Evelyn sat a little straighter. Claire exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. I reached into my purse and removed a sealed envelope. I had prepared it the night before. Inside were copies of several trust summaries Martin approved for discussion. Nothing confidential. Just enough. I placed the envelope in the center of the table. "Before we talk about my future," I said, "I think everyone should understand how Robert structured his estate." Nobody moved at first. Then Claire picked up the papers. As she read, the color slowly drained from her face. Daniel leaned closer. Evelyn's smile disappeared completely. The room grew very quiet. The documents explained only one thing. Major family assets could not be transferred, sold, reassigned, or managed without my direct approval and multiple independent reviews. More importantly, special protections activated if pressure or manipulation was suspected. Daniel looked up first. I did not know this. I believed him, at least partially. Evelyn remained silent. Her eyes continued moving across the pages. "There must be some mistake," she finally said. "No," I replied gently. "There is no mistake." Claire set the papers down. "Mom, nobody is trying to pressure you." The sentence arrived too quickly, too defensively. I noticed it. So did Daniel. For the first time all afternoon, he turned toward his wife instead of toward me. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Nobody seemed sure what to say next. I broke the silence myself. "I am not angry," I said, "but I am paying attention now." Those 7 words changed the room. The confidence that had filled the conversation earlier began to fade. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I accused anyone. simply because I was no longer playing the role they expected. After another few minutes, the meeting ended awkwardly. No papers were signed. No decisions were made. As I stood to leave, Daniel walked me to the front door. Snowflakes drifted through the evening air outside. He looked troubled. Older somehow. "Mom," he said quietly, "is there something I do not know?" I studied his face carefully. Then I remembered Helen's warning, Martin's advice, and Robert's notes. The truth was close now. Closer than ever. "I think," I answered softly, "that there is a great deal several people do not know." Then I stepped outside, carrying my purse beneath one arm. Behind me, through the doorway, I caught a glimpse of Evelyn standing perfectly still in the hallway. And for the first time since this began, she looked worried. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. No one called to argue. No one demanded explanations. Yet I could feel the shift. Something had changed during that meeting. The certainty that once surrounded them was gone. 3 days later, Martin Reynolds called and asked whether I would be available for a brief meeting at my home. When he arrived, he carried a thin folder and the same calm expression he always seemed to wear. We sat in Robert's office while snow drifted past the window. Martin opened the folder and handed me several pages. "I think you are ready to see the full picture," he said. The documents detailed provisions I had never fully understood. Robert had not simply protected assets. He had protected intent. Years earlier, he had written a private letter to accompany the trust. In it, he explained that family inheritance was meant to support relationships, not replace them. If any beneficiary attempted to isolate, manipulate, or pressure another family member for financial advantage, certain distributions could be delayed, reduced, or redirected. I read every word slowly. By the time I reached the final page, I understood why Robert had seemed so at peace during his final months. He had prepared for possibilities I never imagined. "What happens now?" I asked. Martin smiled gently. "That depends entirely on you." After he left, I spent several hours thinking. Not about revenge. Not about punishment. About truth. Over the following week, Daniel called twice. Our conversations were awkward but genuine. For the first time in years, he asked questions instead of offering solutions. He wanted to know how I was sleeping, whether I had been eating properly, whether the furnace was working well during the cold weather. Small questions. Ordinary questions. Yet they felt more sincere than anything I had heard in a long time. Eventually, he asked to visit. When he arrived, he looked tired. Older than I remembered. We sat in the kitchen with coffee between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel sighed. "Mom, I think I stopped paying attention." I looked at him carefully. He stared into his cup. Everything became schedules, plans, responsibilities. I kept assuming someone else was handling things. I never stopped to ask how you felt. There was no dramatic speech. No emotional scene. Just honesty. And honesty carries its own weight. I nodded slowly. "I think that is true." Daniel accepted the answer without argument. Later that afternoon, he told me something else. After our family meeting, he began asking questions of his own. Questions that made certain conversations with Evelyn seem different. Certain assumptions. Certain plans. For the first time, he examined them critically instead of automatically agreeing. I did not press for details. He would have to navigate those answers himself. Several weeks later, I hosted dinner at my house. Not because everything had been repaired. Because healing begins somewhere. Claire attended quietly. Daniel helped set the table. The grandchildren filled the living room with noise and energy. The evening was not perfect. There were pauses, moments of discomfort, unfinished conversations waiting somewhere in the future. But there was also something else. Accountability, awareness, the things that had been missing. After everyone left, I stood alone beside the front window. Snow covered the yard. The house felt warm, peaceful. Robert's photograph sat on the bookshelf nearby. I smiled as I looked at it. The greatest gift he left me was not property. It was clarity. He taught me that kindness does not require surrender. That love does not require blindness. That protecting yourself is not the opposite of caring for others. Months earlier, I would have done almost anything to avoid conflict. Now I understood something much more important. The moment I stopped accepting disrespect, everything began to change. I never signed the papers they brought to that table. I never moved out of my home. And I never spent another holiday wondering whether I deserved a place in my own family. Because by then I finally knew my worth. And once you know your worth, other people lose the power to define it for you.